Good evening. Tonight we are here to present the red line review of the City of Lakewood's Tree Preservation Code. I'm joined tonight by Lisa Gruder from Burke Consulting, who's going to be walking us through the red lines this evening. Lisa, if you want to go ahead and get started. So far, we don't have any attendees who have joined us, but if somebody does come on, we will be having questions and answers at the conclusion of the red line review.
Great. Thank you, Courtney. I'm going to share my screen. We're going to begin with the amendments to the comprehensive plan. This would be an amendment to goal LU 60 and the addition of a policy to LU 60.4. This edit would add a citywide canopy goal. The Planning Commission has reviewed the ad hoc committee's recommendations and material prepared by the consultant team that was provided both to the ad hoc committee and to the Planning Commission. The Planning Commission is interested in a citywide tree canopy goal of 30%. That would be an increase over today's condition of 26%. And it would be a goal to be achieved over to the year 2050. The next set of amendments is to Article 3 for tree preservation. And it begins with an edit that is very similar, which is to add to the purpose statement, tree preservation is an essential strategy for meeting Lakewood's citywide goal of 30% tree canopy cover by the year 2050. After section 18A 7300 purpose, then we get into the tree removal applicability and exemptions. There's two aspects to this set of exemptions. One is that no exemptions apply to the Oregon white oaks, and instead a reference to section 18A 7330 for the Oregon white oak protection standards. So the remaining exemptions are relevant to other tree canopy that is regulated by the tree protection standards. So one change that the committee or the Planning Commission is suggesting for the hearing draft is to make it extra clear in the residential exemptions that lots less than 17,000 square feet in single family zones are exempt, except for lots containing Oregon white oak. So again, another reminder that this exemption is not applicable. The industrially zoned properties are no longer exempt from the chapter. So those are the two main changes. So for a non-Oregon white oak, industrially zoned properties would be subject to this chapter. For residential properties, there's still an exemption for lots less than 17,000 square feet. That exemption does not apply to Oregon white oak. Other exemptions do not apply to Oregon white oak. So moving on to the significant tree preservation. First, in terms of what is a significant tree that is regulated by the tree protection standards, there's a retention of the standard to non-Oregon white oak at 9 inches. For evergreen and deciduous trees, that is remaining. The regulation of Oregon white oaks is, instead of 6 inches, would be at 4 inches. Also, this section would clarify that tree trimming is possible, provided the trimming does not cause the tree to be a safety hazard. This is a clarification to improve the implementation of the code. And then in this section, there's a table on the maximum tree removal on existing single-family lots. That is moved from a later section up to this section, and there's additional clarification that it does not apply to Oregon white oak, so it's consistent with what we were just describing with the exemptions. So the maximum tree removal on developed properties for non-Oregon white oaks is basically the same number of trees that could be removed in 1 year and in 5 years. But that moving this section up front is helpful to the implementation of the code. And Courtney, would you like to add to this?
Yes, thanks, Lisa. The other change from this section is that currently there is no permit required to remove this number of trees. We will now be requiring a simple administrative permit that will be applied for online and then reviewed by our staff against this table. So property owners, single family residential property owners will be able to continue to apply for tree removal using a very standard permit and then or permit application form, and then our staff will review it against these thresholds. And this was recommended because right now, for example, we have this removed in a 5-year period, but we have no mechanism to track it. So this will simply allow for us to be able to track the tree removal on the individual property.
Thank you, Courtney. So it's important here to look at what's being stricken. So what's being stricken is without a permit. So now there would be some way to track those removals. Okay. Then there are some other edits that are consistency edits with the idea that industrial uses would no longer be exempt from this chapter. So it's restoring some text about the application of the section to the industrial uses. And then this paragraph 3 is removed. It doesn't remove critical area protections. Those are still in place in another part of the code, but the language was broad and vague and did not refer back to that part of the city's code. And so it's removed here. We will get later in this package to critical area ordinance amendments. And then some standards around tree retention plans are deleted and replaced with other requirements that relate back to the establishment of a tree removal permit and the kind of information the city needs to see. So back in the new paragraph D, tree removal permit required prior to the removal of any significant tree as described in subsection A above, which is the 9 inches and the 4 inches that we were just looking at for different tree types. And then there's criteria for the tree permits for residential lots, or proposals not associated with a project permit or plan. So there's criteria that the applicant shall submit a complete application using the form provided by the city. And the applicant shall confirm that the proposal complies with the requirements of Article 3 tree preservation. And then those applications and information will be reviewed and approved by the city staff administratively. And then if the proposal does not comply with a requirement, it would be subject to additional review by a certified arborist and or city staff, and a tree retention plan may be required. And this permit can be approved with modifications or denied. Tree permits in non-residential zones or applications that are not associated with a project permit or plan are clarified in subsection F. So for non-residential uses, they would continue to submit a tree retention plan that may involve a tree survey. This subsection would also indicate that Oregon white oaks that are to be retained shall be indicated on the site plan. So that's part of the submittal requirements. And then a new subsection is added around heritage trees. The ad hoc committee had recommended a heritage tree program. There's other sections that tie that to another landmark preservation section of the city's code. But here what this is saying is that these criteria are in addition to the above criteria when the heritage tree removal is proposed. That there be a tree removal permit and that there be an evaluation by city staff and a certified arborist. We have standard construction requirements here. Earlier, we discussed that a table that was regarding maximum tree removal is basically moved up to the top of the section. And as we discussed, the current language does not necessarily require a permit now. There would be a requirement for a permit. Then in terms of tree replacement standards, there's been some clarification that on-site replacement be based on diameter breast height size. And there's an option here that the applicant may choose to plant fewer replacement trees than required by option A, that's based on diameter breast height, if there's the certified arborist determination that they will compensate for the canopy lost when they reach maturity. So it's an either or situation. We moved up from the bottom to earlier in the section that tree trimming is permitted. And then similar to the ad hoc committee recommendations, there would be incentives for preservation. And so there's a range of proposals to allow for variation from standards in order to help preserve trees. So that could be based on altering parking standards, increasing density, allowing for flexibility in master plans that are allowed in the downtown or town center. Also in the station area. And then allowances for reducing otherwise required landscaping as in recognition of preserving Oregon white oaks, and then a building setback reduction for residential, commercial, industrial, and other zones. The Planning Commission also reviewed the ad hoc committee recommendations on increasing enforcement. And the Planning Commission wanted to make sure that it was implementable. And they are suggesting adding a paragraph on the failure to comply being a class 2 civil infraction. And that if there's malicious cutting, that it may result in tripling of the amount of the replacement value. So all the above has generally been about non-Oregon white oaks unless noted. These are, it's about any tree type. Then we get into a special section on the Oregon white oak preservation. So this would be a new section 18A 7330. So first there's a description of the Oregon white oak, also known as Gary oak. And these requirements are in addition to meeting the standards of individual zones and applicable across any zone in the city. So first there's a clarification that any priority white oak woodland or single trees greater than 20 inches will be regulated by the critical areas ordinance. So we'll be going over that in a few minutes. So the rest of these standards are for Oregon white oak trees that are between 4 inches and 20 inches. First, that there would need to be a permit for Oregon white oaks and all trees within critical areas. There is an allowance for removal or topping if the tree is diseased or damaged and presents a danger. And wherever feasible, dead Oregon white oak trees shall be left as snags. Again, cross-referencing the critical areas ordinance for trees greater than 20 inches. Oregon white oak stands with an average diameter breast height DBH of greater than 4 inches but less than 20 inches may be removed, subject to the following: that they are not located in a critical area, that there's no alternative siting in order to construct streets, utilities, or other on-site improvements, and that there be tree replacement at a 2-to-1 ratio. In addition to these standards, for any trees that are on site that require protective measures, so there are trees to be retained and they need to be protected during construction, there would be these additional standards. That there be a critical root zone for the tree, which is a circular area around the tree trunk with a radius plus 1 foot for every inch diameter measured at 4.5 feet above grade. Installing an access deterring fence, posting highly visible and legible signs. And there's more regarding the root zones and avoiding cutting. And then what to do with construction debris and avoiding the tree protection zone. Also not disturbing the soil, and how to maintain equipment. And then if the protective measures above cannot be met due to site-specific conditions, the applicant is required to provide a tree protection plan prepared by a certified arborist. The standards also would not allow hard surface areas within the drip line of the Oregon white oak tree. There's an administrative allowance for hard surfaces up to 25% if there's no practical alternative. Something else that the Planning Commission was considering was whether there could be an advanced mitigation plan for Oregon white oaks so that they are mitigated in advance of development. This city already has a section establishing a city tree fund, and there's some revisions here. First, that in terms of funding sources, where it refers to civil penalties being used, the following sources may be used for enhancing trees. That includes tree permit fees and penalties. That's an addition. In terms of the purposes of the funding, one purpose is restoration or enhancement of native trees like Oregon white oaks, among the other funding purposes. In addition, there would be some additions made to add tree-specific definitions into this Article 3, including reference to industry standards for tree care, certified arborist, critical root zone, DBH, diameter at breast height, drip line, pruning, root pruning, topping, and trimming. This would help establish some clarity around the implementation of this chapter. So this is Article 3. Courtney, anything to add before I go into the critical areas regulations?
I don't think so. Thank you, Lisa. I will mention that we do have one attendee who has joined us. So Ms. Waterhouse, I believe that you should be able to raise your hand if you have any questions, given that you're our only attendee. If you would like to ask questions as we go, we're fine with that. Otherwise, at the end, we will open it for Q&A.
Thank you, Courtney. So the next section of changes is in Title 14 Environmental Protection, which is the critical areas regulations. We're going to focus on a couple of areas where changes have been made. A section has been added to 14.154, Fish and Wildlife Habitat Areas addressing Oregon white oak standards. Some definitions have been added to 14.165. There's very little other changes in this section, so we'll be seeing quite a bit of just regular white pages here. So you'll see basically a lot of the critical area regulations are intact, except where we wanted to add some additional clarifications and protections to Oregon White Oak in response to the ad hoc committee recommendations and the Planning Commission's evaluation of those. So in this section, we have a couple of small edits that refer to Fish and Wildlife recommendations, particularly Oregon White Oak. And because we're creating a new section below this, you'll see that some of that language gets moved later. We are not changing the reasonable use exception section, but you'll see reference to this section in the body of changes that we are making to add in an Oregon White Oak section later. So you may want to refer to this section when you do your own review. Okay, let me get to so we're in habitat protection standards. And here's our new section for priority Oregon white oak trees and woodlands. So this is applicable to white oak trees that are over 20 inches. That was the dividing line between Article 3 and this section. You'll see in the definitions when we get there later. And to priority Oregon white oak woodlands, which the city has already regulated as a critical area. So the first provision is that no one shall willfully remove, top, damage, destroy, break, injure, etc. priority oak, white oak trees and woodlands, except as allowed by the chapter. During building and construction operations, suitable protective measures. This is referring back to Article 3. So we walked through earlier the construction standards for protected trees and what you need to do to avoid drip lines and things like that. That's what this is referring to. And then there's some limited activities allowed for priority white oak trees and woodlands. The removal of diseased trees and trees that present an imminent threat to properties. That requires a written report by a certified arborist. Trimming is allowable when it's needed for safety or public welfare, or to remove diseased or dead branches, or the branches hang over an existing building or interface with utility lines or right-of-way access. And then there's a couple of sections that allow for administrative adjustments to the protection of oak trees that are greater than 20 inches or oak tree woodlands to allow for modest uses. This is sort of an administrative version of a reasonable use. And so first, for a single family property, if the presence of a priority Oregon white oak tree or woodlands renders the development of a house or a permitted accessory structure infeasible, we'll get to the definition of feasible and infeasible later. And the application of all those incentives that we walked through earlier is insufficient to result in a feasible development. So for example, if you've tried everything to adjust parking standards or setbacks, and you still cannot have a reasonably sized home on a lot, the city may allow removal or trimming of an Oregon white oak tree and woodland. And it gives maximum limits on what that exception would be for. for a 1,500 square foot footprint for a single family home, 1,000 square foot for an accessory dwelling unit, and 600 square feet for detached garages. These are similar to modest home provisions and other critical area regulations, and also guidance, for example, from the state on how to allow for accessory dwelling units. And then there's a limitation on allowing for driveways. So what this also says is you have to demonstrate that prior tree removal has been consistent with Article 3, and that what you're proposing is the least possible impact to achieve a feasible development, and it includes mitigation, which would mean a report by a qualified biologist or certified arborist. The city can require a third-party review of that report. There needs to be a minimum 2-to-1 replacement ratio that's similar to the Article 3 standards. And there needs to be some findings later in this section. There's a similar section for non-residential development, so commercial, industrial, multifamily. If you have a property with priority Oregon white oak trees and woodlands that does not exceed 1 acre in size, contiguous, so that might be a 1 acre woodland that crosses over a couple of properties, you count the whole area. And if you can prove that the application of incentives, so that might be height, that might be parking, landscaping, incentives, if the application of all that is insufficient to result in a feasible development, the city may allow for some removal or trimming, provided they demonstrate it's the least possible impact, providing no clearing of trees occurred prior to the application for the land use permit in violation of Article 3, and provided mitigation is instituted based on a report from a qualified professional. Again, the city may require third-party review. And there needs to be a mitigation ratio of 2-to-1. And so then there's a section on required findings that the city would need to make in order to approve those more limited scope allowances. That again, it's restating that you have to demonstrate that you've tried all the incentives possible, that you've provided for the least possible impact, that there's been a sufficient report by a qualified professional that's been reviewed, and that any prior tree removal on the subject properties has met the Article 3. And if these adjustments for a modest sized home or for a smaller woodland on a site are not sufficient to allow for a reasonable use, there is that process that we were describing earlier, a reasonable use exception that goes before the hearing examiner. That's the body of the changes in the main part of the regulations. The next set of changes are in the definitions. So again, you're going to see quite a number of white pages before we get there. So we're not changing flood hazard or wetland regulations or things like that. Or streams, if there's trees in the buffers for those areas, they would be protected. That has not changed. Here we are into definitions. So one new definition, which is based on a similar definition in the Shoreline Master Program rules that the Department of Ecology maintains for shoreline areas, which are typically areas within 200 feet of major water bodies, major lakes in Lakewood and the marine waters. So this is a definition of feasible, that in determining what's feasible or conversely what's infeasible, you would use this definition. That development meets all of the following conditions: that the action can be accomplished with technologies and methods that have been used in the past. The action provides a reasonable likelihood of achieving its intended purpose, and the action does not physically preclude achieving the project's primary legal use. So in cases where the chapter requires certain actions unless they are infeasible, the burden of proving infeasibility is on the applicant, and the director may weigh the action's relative public costs and benefits in determining infeasibility. So that can be referred to as the conditions for those limited scope adjustments, like the modest single family home are considered. The other change to the definitions is regarding priority Oak Woodlands. We're adding the single tree above 20 inches. Here we are, priority white oak trees and woodlands. And so it's adding in basically language that recognizes individual trees that are at least a diameter at breast height of 20 inches or more, or stands with an average diameter at breast height of 20 inches or more. And then similar to the current code, Oregon white oak stands found to be particularly valuable for fish and wildlife habitat. Because there's language up above that looks at the size of trees, that's removed here because it's being specified up above. And there's reference being made to an evaluation by the Department of Fish and Wildlife or qualified expert report in terms of determining what is particularly valuable to fish and wildlife. So Courtney, I believe that is capturing the main amendments. I can stop sharing it unless you wanted to go back to anything in particular.
No, thank you, Lisa. I just want to reiterate that the purpose of this red line review is that we are having a public hearing before the Planning Commission on July 6th. That public hearing will be open to the public, both virtually as well as in person. Comments submitted ahead of time, written comments submitted ahead of time are due June 30th, and you can make comments by going to cityoflakewood.us/trees. /trees, and there's a link embedded there. You can also drop written comments off at City Hall, or you can email them to me at cbrunell, CBRUNELL @cityoflakewood.us. And all of those comments will be forwarded to the Planning Commission ahead of time. Additionally, individuals can come and provide testimony the night of the public hearing, again, virtually via Zoom or in person at City Hall and in council chambers. And the Planning Commission will review all of those comments before making final recommendations to the City Council. Once we get to the City Council, there will be an additional public hearing. Right now, we're tentatively scheduled to start their review in August, and so I would expect the public hearing to occur sometime in August or early September. So with that, do we have any questions? We have one attendee I'm going to allow to talk. If you have any questions, please feel free. Otherwise, we will be moving this onto Zoom or onto YouTube for folks to be able to refer to while they prepare their comments. Seeing no questions. Thank you to our attendee for joining us. Thank you, Lisa and Hayden, for guiding the presentation this evening. And with that, we hope to see lots of comments and folks at our public hearing on July 6th. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.